The first point I'd like to make is this war actually started in 2014 when the Americans provoked the coup in Kiev, where the far right and fascists took over, and then the attacks on the Russian speakers began, and the Russian speakers revolted against that, and that's why you had Crimea left Ukraine and joined Russia, and the people of Donbass resisted the far right forces that were attacking them. So my first point is that the Russian speakers of the Donbass and Crimea should have the right to self-determination. If they don't want to be part of a far right Ukraine, they shouldn't be part of a far right Ukraine. I've been to Crimea. The people are Russian. They identify as Russian. They've been Russian for 200 years. It's ridiculous for Britain and the US to support Crimea and the Donbass being taken by force. That would simply mean the ethnic cleansing of the people that live there. And that's why I disagree with those that say Russian troops out now. If the Russian troops remove themselves from these areas now, there will be a massacre of the ordinary Russian speakers. So that is not a slogan we put forward. We put forward a democratic peace where the people of Donbass and the Crimea get the right to decide, and it's obvious they voted to be part of Russia. The second thing is Ukraine should be demilitarised. It should not be part of Nato, and it shouldn't have missiles based on it pointing at Moscow. How would the Americans react if Mexico or Cuba had missiles pointed at them? Well, we know how they reacted in Cuba. They said if you don't remove them, there's going to be a world war. So it's ridiculous to support and fund a war that is an obvious threat to the Russian people. And what is this war really about? It's a war of regime change in Moscow. That's what America wants. America that wants to continue to dominate the world as they have done since 1990, where they've invaded country after country, Yugoslavia, Serbia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, etc. They seem to think they've got the right to do that, and no one takes them to court. They put charges against Putin because he's rescued children, orphans from the Donbass and taken them to a peaceful area. And yet there's no criminal charges against Bush, Obama, etc., who have launched wars of aggression repeatedly. So I think what's really behind this war is the Americans are not prepared to see any other country stand up to them. They're frightened that China is now a powerful country with a powerful economy, and they're not willing to accept that. And so this war drive isn't just against the Russians. In the last analysis, it's against the Chinese as well, because the Americans want a unipolar world where they dominate things. And what's the UK's response? It's just been totally to go along with the Americans, even more aggressive than the Americans. It was Boris Johnson that flew over at the end of March to Kiev to tell Zelensky not to accept the peace deal, which was near to being signed, saying that was not to happen. Originally the British said we're not supplying weapons, they're now supplying tanks, jets, etc., funding it all. Plus, there's now talk of sending peacekeepers, a European peacekeeper force of 300,000. These are not peacekeepers. That would be an invasion force sent by the EU with American support to take on the Russians. And if that happens, we're looking at nuclear war. That's the reality of it. The Russians won't allow the people of Crimea or the people of Donbass to be subjugated by the fascist forces in Kiev. They just won't allow it. And if that starts to happen, we're looking at nuclear war. So it's vitally important that we build a movement to say an end to this war. Let's have a peace deal that is democratic and recognises everyone's rights. No, I mean, the Ukraine would still exist. There's never any suggestion from Putin that they were trying to do away with Ukraine. It was the Russian-speaking areas were being protected. Just before the Russians went in February, there was a mass force of far right. The Azov Brigade were on the border with Donbass getting ready to attack, and the Russians intervened to stop that and preempt that attack. So that's the reality of it. They're not telling us that in the media. They're trying to present it as if the Russians are trying to take over the world. Nonsense. The Russians have no dynamic towards that. The truth is the Americans want to keep hold of the world.
Well done. The mic on?
I don't know.
You say there enough, I didn't know.